Hello, everybody. It's MJ, and today we're going to go over heavy tanks at tier 10, right? So I already did the TD one. I'm going to do the heavy one. Again, if you guys don't know me, I'm a ex-pro Blitz player. I played for teams like Joker, Leverage, and Origin. I have like 5 or 6 championships under my belt under the NA server, right? So I obviously know a little bit of what I'm talking about when it comes to understanding tier 10, which is the highest performance level in the game, right? So we're just going to go over heavy tanks. Again, like I said, I'm just going to give my nuanced approach on just heavy tanks because ranking heavy tanks against medium tanks, TDs, light tanks doesn't really give you a good idea of what's the best tanks within each class type, right? So without further ado, I'm just going to start it off, right? We got the 114 SP2. Now, unfortunately, with this tank, Wargaming just continues to make this thing subpar. And for that reason, it's just going to go into why play this, right? Ultimately, this thing is just a worse 60 TP in every way. Worse gun stats, worse armor, arguably worse DPM since the 60 TP has tungsten and is able to slap things for about 700 alpha, right? While this thing kind of just suffers at 620. There's really no redeeming quality for this thing. And for that reason, it's going into why play this, right? 116 F3. There was a time period in which I would say this thing was pretty overpowered, at least when it had reactive and had the clip gun. Unfortunately, nowadays it has dropped a little bit. I would say it's right around the super competitive category. Main reason for that, it still has a strong armor profile, probably akin to something like an IS-4 is probably the best way to describe it, and like an IS-4 and 113 while having a clip gun, right? So it's 420 alpha times 3. I do recommend running the clip gun. You're going to get more bang for your buck with the clip gun, even though it has less DPM. You're just going to be able to make trades a lot more effectively than with the single shot gun, since the armor on this thing isn't that good at bouncing, especially for heat. However, it is good enough to where you will get bounces against standard. In face hug, it's pretty decent. Overall, though, the clip gun is what's going to give you a good play style for this tank, right? Next tank is going to be the 50B. Now, there was a time long ago where this thing with the 3-shot would have been super competitive or even overpowered for a good player, right? So I am talking about players that are about 60% or higher. I don't really care for like 50% and lower just because you're not playing these tanks to their full capability, right? The 50B, honestly, it's probably just going to go in strong. Like, it is still very deadly with the clip. You will get a lot of value out of the clip and the speed for this tank. Ultimately, though, it's just not going to win as much as something like a 116 F3. It has more DPM than a 116 F3, but it doesn't have the armor to get you by. And then it's also just massive, right? There was a time where you were able to bait shots into the front plate, which was super strong, and even get bounces on the turret. Unfortunately, those days are kind of past us. And for that reason, it's definitely going into strong. I honestly, for your top players, I can see it going into super competitive. But for this ranking, it's definitely going to go into strong, which is a pretty safe spot for it, right? 5A, honestly, this thing, all it needs is a heat pen buff and then maybe an alpha buff back to 460. When this thing had 460 alpha with 2800 DPM and they buffed the gun stats to be notably better than the IS-7, this thing just felt amazing. Unfortunately, when they did nerf the armor on the hull, make it 440 alpha, and then buff the DPM slightly, it really just didn't help this tank all that much. And in fact, I think it detracted from the tank a lot. And ultimately, this thing just has a terrible heat round. And for that reason, it just feels mid and situational. There are moments where the DPM feels amazing. And then there's just other moments where you can't pen anything, hold down, and going against other heavies. 60 TP ultimately is going to go into super competitive. There's not much really to say about this thing. Like I said, it's just a 114 SP2, but better in every way. You have an amazing turret, amazing hull for bouncing. You have an amazing gun that got buffed on its aim time, so the aim time still feels pretty snappy for a gun of this caliber and a like what is essentially a super heavy. And not only does it play kind of like a super heavy, it's also very nimble for a super heavy. You get gear oil, which allows this thing to reverse pretty fast and then also go forward pretty fast. You are getting upwards of like 38 to 40 kilometers per hour forward and even like 20 reverse, which is just ultimately very good for this tank. It's able to side scrape it's the best, not side scrape. It's the best face hugger at the tier, in my opinion. There's very few tanks that compete against it, and on top of it, tungsten, like I said, right? So easy placement for that. Atlas, I would say this thing is mid and situational if you're running the auto loading gun. However, just due to how it is, I would say this thing does go into the strong category. I wouldn't say super competitive. I don't think it competes with your top hitters like a 60 TP and a 114 SP2. However, if this thing is close in like a brawl scenario, the auto-loading gun does make up for it with just DPM and the fact that a clip does around 600 to 700 damage, right? So this thing is able to hold its own in those close engagements. It kind of just falls off once you go into distance, and if you're wanting to play this thing a little bit more distance-wise, I would recommend running the single shotgun with 480 alpha. However, you're just not going to have the DPM to really compete against things close up. But ultimately, this thing is fast for how much armor it has, and just overall a pretty good heavy. Nothing to complain about there. BZ75, this thing I could see it going into strong. However, just due to how it is, it kind of just falls into the mid situational category, same as the 5A. I would say in terms if you're running the 130 millimeter on the BZ75, it is going to feel like a worse 5A. Sure, you have more armor, but ultimately the 5A has a better turret that will bounce a lot more heat rounds. The BZ75 kind of suffers where on the sides of the gun, it's just going to get penned by most heat rounds at the tier. And then on top of that, the 152 millimeter, which although very fun for the BZ75 and arguably the more preferable gun to use on it, I just feel like there are situations where you're kind of just losing out on DPM just because you're only using AP ammunition against heavies frontally, right? BZT70, there's really nothing much to say about this thing. It is the worst heavy at the tier by far. It is basically BZ75 with Hesh, with the Hesh gun, right? Except that the Hesh does way more damage at the cost of losing everything else, right? This thing is incredibly slow on reverse. It's decently fast forward for what it is. However, it's shaped and the size of a super heavy, but it has 2400 HP and it has no armor, right? So you basically lose out everything for that alpha, and overall it's just not going to be worth it, right? Chieftain. Chieftain, honestly, there was a time where I would say super competitive when it had its premium round. However, nowadays, now that it has Hesh, honestly, it just does not compete with the heavy hitters at super competitive. Honestly, it's just going to fall into strong. I would say if you're farming damage, it's definitely going to be better than an Atlas, and it's definitely going to dominate a Ridgeline a little bit better, right? Ultimately, the Chieftain is still a very good tank. However, due to the fact that it doesn't have its premium round for higher pen, it's premium APCR, it's just not going to be able to pen, tanks with more armor, right? So you are going to struggle against things like a Mouse, Type 5 Heavy, and ultimately that just hinders it from being super competitive, right? Still has tungsten, still has Hesh, still hits hard, and has amazing DPM, right? Next tank, Concept. It's going straight into the overpowered category. No questions there. This thing is essentially a medium with a impenetrable hold down armor profile, right? And you're nuking for upwards to 760 is the clip potential. But realistically, sometimes you're hitting for 800 in 2.5 seconds, and you only got like a 14.6 second reload to reload the entire thing, right? Ultimately, this thing, the amount of exposure time it does, which is 2.5 seconds, and doing that much damage while basically being invincible hold down, it's just going to be toxic, right? There's no other way to put it. It's able to get to medium flanks and just abuse ridge lines. There's no other way to put it, right? E100. Honestly, E100 has been all over the place recently. Wargaming has decided that the 12.8 centimeter gun is the way that they're going to play this thing. However, I think the 15 centimeter gun is the intended play style for the 100, right? I understand that the 15 centimeter is the worst gun on it right now. However, the E100 has always been a trading heavy. It's never been a high DPM, get into heavy brawl heavy. And for that reason, I just feel like it's not really fitting into its niche anymore. when this thing had 640 alpha back in like 2018 and it was running 14.5 second reload, that's when this thing shined, right? It still didn't have the most armor. It wasn't going to bounce, but all you had to do was trade, and with the DPM that this thing had at 14 seconds, you were just making very good trades all the time, right? And honestly, there's just not a reason to really pick the E100 with a 15 centimeter when the 60 TP exists, right? So ultimately, this thing is going to fall behind a lot just due to the fact that it's 12.8 centimeter, although you have DPM, you kind of are just forced to go into DPM brawls with heavies. And by the point that you're exiting said DPM brawl, you're kind of already at like half health because nobody's going to be bouncing you. Calibrated has essentially removed the armor on this tank again, even after the buff. So it's just overall not worth it. E5, easily super competitive. Now, would I say it's better than a 116 or a 60 TP for winning? I would honestly say overall it's probably going to be better than the 116 for winning, just because it has more reliable and consistent DPM, and it's able to just pen everything, hold down if you're running Cali. The gun stats are amazing on the E5. It's very nimble. They buffed its traverse, and the turret is just honestly pretty impenetrable. You can still heat pen it with some high pen heat and the cupola, although the cupola is very hard to hit. The DPM makes it very consistent for brawling, and then it also, on top of it, if you're running sandbags with HP, you're upwards of 2600 HP, right? That being said, single shot heavies with 400 alpha right now kind of just feel very subpar compared to things like a 116 that's able to dump damage, and then a 60 TP that's able to just nuke. The only reason I'm putting the 116 behind it is just the 116 doesn't have the DPM to keep up for some battles, and that definitely hinders it, right? Felice. I would say that there was a time when this thing first came out, definitely overpowered category. However, a lot of people, it honestly just came into being kind of like the VK90 when it first came out. VK90, everybody under the sun, every greener called it the most overpowered vehicle at the tier. However, it just doesn't have the DPM, and a lot of people, once they realize that they can't pen it and deal with it in a side scrape, they're just going to ignore it, right? Felice suffers from the same thing. Yes, its gun is very deadly. Yes, it's like super toxic. Unfortunately, though, it kind of just lags behind a lot when it comes to brawls. The DPM isn't really that high to consider like winning in DPM brawls. A lot of times you're just going to be caught dumping to get like a kill on a tank, and then you're kind of just shit out of luck when it comes to dealing with other tanks, because now you're on a very long reload unless you want to eat into the reserve shell. Overall, 116 is just going to feel better when it comes to brawling. You're going to be able to, the 116 is just faster. You're going to be able to catch up to brawls that are happening and just put your DPM to use, right? Next tank, 215B. Now, this is one of your single shot heavies at the tier that really hasn't suffered that much overall. And that just honestly comes down to the fact that the gun is so versatile. It has the 3 most versatile rounds on a single gun at the tier, and that honestly just makes it competitive for the best gun at the tier on a heavy, right? You have an amazing AP round, you have an amazing APCR round, and on top of it, you get cheap Hesh, right? That is honestly comparable to the Chieftains. It does more damage, and it's just, lower in HE potential, but you're kind of just HEing the same targets and the same armor plating that the Chieftain does, right? And the 215B does this all while still having a premium round and just overall better armor than the Chieftain. And for that reason, it's just a better version, and it's honestly just what the Chieftain wants to be, right? G-Sor the tank. Now, this thing, this is another one where a lot of people, when it first came out, were like, oh, this is OP. It's another OP heavy one like an E6. Overall, though, I think this thing is just a worse E6 and also just a worse Chieftain, right? Yes, you have 12 degrees of gun depression. However, even at 12 degrees of gun depression, the turret armor kind of feels very janky and weird. Like, yes, you will get bounces, but you will also like get penned randomly by TDs sometimes, and even heavies, right? And for that reason, it just feels very unreliable. It's not a reliable turret, it is a troll turret. And for that reason, I think the Chieftain does beat it out, just because the Chieftain has overall more DPM, it has Hesh for a premium round, and it has tungsten, right? So you're able to put a lot more DPM down range in the Chieftain than you are the G-Sor tank. And for that reason, it just overall kind of lags behind because it doesn't have that high of a DPM marker, right? So the IS-4, is the next one. Now, obviously, me being an IS4 main for comp and all those years, I really want to put it super competitive. However, I just don't think this is a single shot tank that I don't think really keeps up in the current state of the game. And for that reason, I will say that it's probably going to go into strong. Although, now that I think about it, I would say super competitive, in all honesty. Ultimately, the IS4, yes, it may lag behind in some DPM and alpha consideration. However, this thing just doesn't die, right? I think overall, this thing is still going to be super competitive just because the turret is almost impenetrable. Yes, there's a little bit of it that you can pen. It's an amazing side scraper. It still has super speed boost. The only consideration you have to make with super speed boost is this thing's armor relies on you wiggling and baiting track wheels. So if you do get tracked and you have super speed boost and adrenaline, you only have one repair kit to fall back on. So I do recommend protective kit. However, this thing is just super survivable and super easy to win in brawls, right? Especially in face hugs. So I still think that there is value in running the IS4. You may not be doing the most damage, but you're still going to win considerably, right? IS7, I feel like this thing has fallen off considerably since they constantly tried to change it around, right? They honestly tried to make it the IS4, like the strong, super hold down, super like side scrape, super like heavy IS4. Ultimately, though, they kind of failed at it, and as a result, this thing has just become a nothing burger almost. It's kind of just become super mid, right? Ultimately, yes, they buffed the APCR pen on its premium round. They nerfed the lower plate, and then they nerfed the speed. So ultimately, this thing, I just feel it feels worse than its 50 kilometers per hour with worse armor days. It doesn't really get the same job done. Yes, it has tungsten, but when it's competing against tanks with tungsten, like the Chieftain or the 60 TP, those tanks just have more higher DPM and more alpha consideration, right? And this thing is just not accurate enough for me to really feel like it's warranting, having 460 with tungsten. Next tank, KPZ. Now, I will say this thing, it may not be the most competitive, right? It definitely won't be super competitive. However, I do think it goes into the strong category, and it's honestly probably going to go right here, right? Overall, I think this thing, if you're a 60% player and you play this thing right and you play it kind of like a support heavy, you're going to get a lot of value out of this thing just because it is the most accurate 152 millimeter gun on a heavy at the tier. Yes, it has lower, alpha at 560, but you got tungsten to make up for that. You have a very nice reload of 13 seconds, 13.9, I think, if you're running Kali, right? This thing has amazing acceleration, and you're going to be able to get to a lot of key points very quickly with this thing, going like 40, right? And ultimately, I just find it just a more enjoyable experience right now than the E100, right? You're going to be able to get some bounces on the turret and the upper glasses. I wouldn't say rely on the armor, but you will get those bounces occasionally. And for that reason, definitely a strong vehicle, but definitely not super competitive. And now we go to the Kron, right? The Kron, I don't think this thing needs any introduction. It's just overpowered as all hell right now. You have comparable DPM to the E5 on its first shell. And then at the end of those 60 seconds, you could just dump and you have an effective DPM of 3,400 DPM, right? It's just an absurd vehicle. You can't pen it hold down. It goes 36. You got super speed boost and you have reticle calibration. There's no reason that this thing should be as good as it is right now, and it's definitely going to get nerfed, right? Emily, I would say Emily's currently right now pretty strong, right? I would say this thing overall, you're definitely gonna win more than a 50B, and honestly, like a Atlas. I don't think it really goes that much higher, just because I feel like the skill cap or the skill ceiling on the G-Sor and the Chieftain is a little bit higher than this thing, and this thing honestly just has pretty poor accuracy, and that's what holds this thing back a lot. Everything else about the tank is great. Great reverse speed, good alpha at 450. A good AP round, a good heat round, amazing armor on the front, right? Ultimately, it just comes down to the accuracy, and it's just not reliable enough to warrant me placing this any higher, right? Next, Mouse. I would say overall, yes, this thing does win. It has the highest relative win rate at tier 10. but I just feel like this thing right now is very mid and situational. It's very game dependent. There's games where you're just going to get buttered because you get surrounded very quick. Its main strength is just being in town brawls, and if you're anywhere else, you kind of feel just out in the open and kind of weak, right? The gun stats on it are just terrible right now. It's just not hitting reliably, and it's arguably worse than the IS-7, right? And on top of that, the 12.8 centimeter is just a worse version of the E100s. The E100s is better on accuracy, DPM, right? There's really no reason to run the mouse when you have an E100. You're going to just farm more damage and probably win more in the E100. And for that reason, I would say mouse is definitely mid and situational. Next is Yo. Yo, I feel in the last 1 to 2 years has fallen off quite considerably. And that just comes down to a lot of the other clippers at the tier just feel a lot more potent. We'll get to it later, but the VZ75 basically clips for more than this tank. Yes, it doesn't do it as fast, but the VZ75 has better armor, better speed, maybe not 10 degrees of gun depression, but you're just overall just going to have a better experience in the VZ55 than you will in a Yo, right? I do think this thing goes into strong, and I do think it's probably better than like an IS-7. However, I don't think that goes much higher. It is more versatile and flexible than an IS-7, but the E100 and tanks like the KPZ are just more versatile in general. You're just going to have a better time when it comes to just outputting damage. Yes, the Yo is easy to output damage, but it honestly just relies on the crutch of having reticle calibration for the 2-shot gun to work, and the 3-shot gun, in my opinion, is basically useless at the tier just because you don't clip for enough. The DPM is high, yes, but it doesn't warrant the amount of exposure time you have doing 300 times 3 for you to be exposed for that long. And for that reason, honestly, it's in strong right now. They need to do something with it, either buff the armor, the speed, or the alpha on the 300 alpha gun. But other than that, I think it's a pretty good ranking for it right now. 260, I would say the 260 has grown on me in recent years, right? I don't think it's as fun as it was when it had 420 alpha. However, I do think it's an overall better tank, right? I think if you play this thing to its absolute best level, you're definitely going to get a lot more value out of something like, the KPZ and the E100, just because you have basically the same DPM as an E100 with the 12.8 centimeter, but you have a heat round to fall back on, you have the speed to fall back on, and you're able to chase and put that DPM to use, right? You have a great reverse speed. You don't have the most armor in the world, but you have combat stabs. The gun is very snappy and very accurate for what it is. If you're running Kali, you're running around 2,900 DPM, and if you run Ram, you're running 3,100 DPM, right? And that's honestly very good for a Heavium style tank such as this. And honestly, the turret on this thing is not that bad anymore. Yes, you'll still get penned occasionally, especially if you're like at max gun depression, because the turret does get weaker at max gun depression. But you're just going to have overall a pretty good experience with the 260 if you're a 60% player and up, right? 777. Now, I honestly despise this tank, and the reason I despise this tank is it just feels like a way less flexible 113, right? It feels like the 113 back when you just couldn't turn the thing and it turned like a boat. And ultimately, the armor is troll on this thing. However, I don't find that it's reliable armor, right? That's two different things. Reliable armor, you can angle, you can like maneuver it in a way that you will manufacture bounces that you're pretty confident will happen. The 777 in side scrape, right? In theory, it's going to bounce. However, a lot of the time, you're just going to get randomly penned through the roof of the turret, through the turret ring right below it, and then also through the track wheel sometimes randomly. It's just overall just not that reliable in my opinion. And then also it kind of suffers from like what the VK90 suffers from. If there's like tanks on the side of you or just slightly off center of you, you're just not going to have a good time dealing with them, right? Because this thing turns like an absolute boat. So I will say this thing is definitely going to be better than your 5A and your BZ75 and your mouse, but it does ultimately fall into like mid and situational. And for that reason, like it has a lot going for it. However, a lot of the times, especially in brawls, you're just going to feel it being very lackluster because you can't turn quick enough to manufacture bounces, and people are just going to abuse that fact, right? You're going to have a meta on your side, and your game's basically done at that point. Next tank, Rhino. Now, I know a lot of people think this thing was butchered, which it was butchered on DPM. However, they did make up for it by giving it 10 degrees of gun depression with the gun depression equipment that the Type 71 gets. And for that reason, I do still think this thing is super competitive. I think overall, you're just going to have a better experience in this thing when it comes to winning than you will in like something the Felice and the IS-4. If you're using the gun depression equipment and you go hold down with 10 degrees of gun depression on this thing, you're feasibly not really penning this thing unless you're running upwards of 400 millimeters of heat pen. And for that reason, this thing, you can kind of just abuse it, right? It is overall just a worse cron, but it's a little bit more fun than the cron just because it has better gun stats. You have 420 alpha times 2. It's overall faster in a straight line than the cron. It's still just a very fun tank, and for that reason, I would definitely put in super competitive still. Next tank, Sturv K. Now, I really do want to like the Sturv K. However, this is kind of a why play this tank, right? You kind of just have too many tanks that fit the heavium role that just do a overall better job of it. And for that reason, like it's just going to go into why play this, right? You got tanks at this tier like the Chieftain, the G-Sword tank, 260 arguably, right? And ultimately the E6 that just do a way better job at the heavium role and abusing meds than this thing does. And for that reason, it's just sadly going to go into why play this, right? Super Conk. Overall, probably strong, right? This thing does have a lot going for it. You're able to side scrape in a tank that's predominantly a hold down play style. It kind of plays like a British E5, but you're able to side scrape. You have 3k DPM. Ultimately, though, what I think holds this tank back is just its accuracy, its lack of pen on its premium round, and the fact that you kind of just get HE splash when you go hold down, right? If people can't pen you, they're just going to HE splash, and they're going to do upwards of 100 to 200 damage consistently, even with low pen and like low caliber guns. And for that reason, it kind of just feels lackluster when you miss a shot just due to the gun being overall very inaccurate, and then they're just splashing you and constantly belittling your health, right? That's something the E5 doesn't really struggle on, and for that reason, E5 is where it is. And it's the E5 is overall faster. I just think that this thing in its current state does struggle a bit, but for winning purposes and just, you know, DPM and getting some damage per game, you're definitely going to have a better experience in the Super Conk than you will in a MLE per se. Next tank, where is it? T57. See, this thing used to be such a great tank. However, it's kind of fallen into the same trap the 50B has, where the 50B has fallen into that for different reasons. The T57 ultimately, its clip just got neutered, right? It went from 400 alpha to 375 times 3, while still being good for clipping for around 1,000, right? A lot of times I just find this thing low rolling too much, and your clip is just not worth the trade that you get into, right? There's a lot of tanks right now where you're just going to trade with, and it's just overall the trade's just not going to be worth it. And I don't think the reload for the overall clip on this thing is fast enough to warrant the nerf to the alpha. And for that reason, it just kind of feels lackluster right now. I would say this thing definitely still goes into strong, and I do think it will be better than the Yo and an i7 overall, just because you still got heat, you still got a pretty snappy gun for it. You got decent turret armor at that. However, I still just think that this thing could use a DPM buff in its current state. E6. This is an easy placement for me. E6 still goes into super competitive. There's really no other way to say it, especially for the tier and just, you know, the fact that this is pubs. Overall, it is just way more flexible than something like the 116. It has way more DPM than the Rhino, and it's just way more flexible than an IS-4 and a Felice. It's able to abuse a med flank. It has 3,200 DPM, right? You're able to, you have combat stabs. It may not have the best armor, which is why I put it below these three right here, just because I think these three overall are going to win you more games than the E6. However, the E6 ultimately is just the best heavy in the game, right? And for that reason, it's definitely going to super competitive. Type 5 Heavy. Now, the Type 5 Heavy is essentially what you get when you take a mouse and an E100 with the 15 centimeter and you have a child, and then you just buff the alpha massively, right? The mouse struggles behind the Type 5 just because in the current state of the game, alpha kind of is king, right? The more nukes that you get, the more likely you are to win, unfortunately. And honestly, the mouse gun is just so inconsistent, and you have to fire so much to get off a good amount of damage, where the Type 5 can just do it in one shot compared to a mouse's two, right? And for that reason, you have to aim a lot less, you have to poke a lot less in the Type 5, so you're just overall going to have a better experience in the Type 5. And honestly, I would rather play this thing right now than the E100, even with the 12.8 centimeter, right? The 12.8 centimeter on the E100 just makes me poke too often, and you're just going to get penned all the time, especially like on NA. People are smart enough to use heat. They're just going to pen this thing all day, every day. Type 5, at least you're minimizing exposure time because you're only poking every 19 seconds and getting a huge nuke off. Type 71, this is a tank where I honestly think this goes into mid-situational. I do think that, yes, it does have better armor and it does have more pen than the 5A. I honestly just think that this thing is kind of just mid in every regard. There's a lot of times where you just feel like just lackluster on DPM. Sure, the premium round is nice, 335 millimeters of pen of AP on the premium is great, and you barely have any drop off on DPM because you don't barely lose any alpha. However, I don't think the DPM and the alpha is, that good to warrant like you feeling a difference, right? And ultimately this thing is just very sluggish right now, right? And for that reason, I just feel 5A and the 777 overall, you're just going to have a better experience on these two tanks compared to the Type 71. Now, it is going to be better than something like a BZ75. You are going to get more bounces, but for what they've tried to make this thing, it kind of just is a nothing burger right now. And there's a lot of other single shot heavies that will just bully a Type 71 right now. VK72, this thing reminds me a lot of the old E100 back when it had 2300 HP and 14.5 second reload of 640 alpha, right? Now, granted, this thing has 600 alpha. Let's not excuse that. And then on top of that, it has tungsten, so it is able to slap pretty hard, and overall, it does have better gun stats than the 15 centimeter on the E100, right? And overall, I do think you're going to get more value with this thing than something like the KPZ and the Type 5, and that ultimately just comes down to the fact that you have more armor frontally. You're able to go hold down with just the turret. The gun is pretty snappy. It has pretty good stats on its AP round, its HE round, and its heat round. And then on top of that, just you get the mobility equipment that the Type 71 gets. So you're overall just a more nimble, super heavy. And for that reason, you're just able to just go for pokes, right? And then also bounce by just poking out your front, right? So overall, strong. However, I don't think it's as good as it used to be. And for that reason, it's going into strong. VK90. Now, I know everybody loves the VK90. At least the greeners and the 50%ers and the white percenters do, right? But ultimately, this thing is just the king of mid and situational, right? This thing is kind of just a nothing burger at heart. It feels like a mouse, just not as good in a way. But also, overall, you're just going to win more in this thing just because it has better armor. However, it kind of just stops there, right? All the armor is focused on the front of this thing, and the best way to angle your turret to the enemy is just look directly at them, right? And that just means that if there's any tank slightly off center of you, they're going to be able to butter your turret with heat all day, every day. And for that reason, it's kind of just a situational beast where it's going to go and side scrape. But the issue is a lot of tanks will, a lot of players will just ignore you if you're in a side scrape. They'll either HE you, they have enough pen to go through your turret reliably, so they'll just, sit there and aim in and then heat pen you. Overall, this thing just doesn't have the alpha and the DPM to keep up with a lot of the turbo battles, and for that reason, it is definitely going into mid and situational. VZ55, like I said, this thing has had a massive glow up in recent years. I will say that I think the 116 F3 overall, you're just going to get a lot more value out of it just because not as many, the Cupola on the VZ55 is just overall bigger and a lot more people hit it. However, the 116 just has, a larger clip and may not have the same DPM as the VZ. However, that clip is super potent and you're just able to just nuke people, right? You're still able to nuke in the VZ. Let's not get us wrong, right? I did say this thing is just a better yo. It basically is. You have a pseudo IS 7 armor profile, obviously with a cupola on top. You have very good armor on the upper glacis along with the turret. And then on top of that, you got a 460 alpha gun ×2 in 3 seconds, right? So you're nuking pretty reliably. And on top of that, you got combat stabs and very good gun stats for what it is. And on top of that, gear oil. So you're able to remove one of the weakest points of this tank, which was its reverse speed. And for that reason, it's just overall, it just nukes. It's an amazing tank. Definitely recommend picking it up. It feels amazing. 113 heavy. Now, this thing has fallen from grace arguably more than any other tank, right? At some point, it was comparable to the 215B, and it would compete with it directly. However, this thing has just fallen off considerably ever since, just due to the fact that Wargaming keeps on buffing parameters of this tank that didn't make the 113 the 113, such as armor profile, side plating. None of that really mattered for this tank. What did matter was the DPM that this thing had and the very good heat pen that it had, right? The heat pen is still very good, don't get me wrong. However, they nerfed the alpha and the DPM overall. They reduced it to 400. Now it's back to 410. Overall, nerfed the reload overall. So you're sitting around 3K DPM, maybe 3100 with rammer. And it just feels very lackluster, right? When something like the 215B has comparable DPM and you just have better rounds allocated to you with the Hesh rounds and the APCR round, right? And just better gun stats. 113 still feels good. It will still just pick up and move and at a very quick rate since they have buffed mobility constantly. However, the DPM has fallen off considerably. And for that reason, I do think it's just going to perform better than a 260, but I don't think it goes much higher than that, right? Next tank, last but not least, SPHT. Now, this thing is a conundrum, right? Because there are times where this thing feels lackluster and just dealing damage. However, ultimately, 3,500 HP on what is essentially a weaker armored E5 with the same DPM is just stupid game design, and they should 100% nerf this tank. It is overpowered for pubs, right? And it ultimately just comes down to a lot of the heavies that you see on the screen can fire at this thing for an entire minute, and they will not kill this thing in an entire minute, right? And for that reason, it's just overall just a stupid tank, right? You have 2,900 DPM if you're running rammer, around 2,700 DPM if you're running Kali. You have 3,500 DPM, decent gun stats. It's just a dumb tank, right? You're a better mouse. You're able to soak more. You're able to just out DPM things, not because you have better DPM than tanks, but because you have more HP than them. And for that reason, It is just the king of just making dumb plays, and every player that plays this thing will get away with dumb plays, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? Overall, though, I think that is all the tier 10 heavies at the tier. This is the compiled list. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns about the list, by all means, be sure to ask. If you think any tank deserves to be higher or lower in this list, by all means, comment it. I would love to hear your guys' opinions. But I honestly think if you want a list to, for tanks to grind and where each tank ranks against each other, this is the best list that you're going to find when it comes to heavies. And for that reason, I think you should like and subscribe. But without further ado, have a blessed rest of your day, and peace out.